Thank you all for joining us today. Thank my panel. We're going to try to keep things obviously moving very quickly as we go through this, but before, a couple questions for the audience so we can calibrate a little bit. How many of you are venture or capital side of the world? And then how many of you are operators or execs or the labor side, as Marx would frame the distinction? Excellent. Excellent. All right, one more question. We're talking about change. How many of you think the AI transformation that we're going through will be greater in scale than the mobile transition we went through a decade ago? Okay, just keep your hands up if you agree. Okay, how many of you think it's going to be bigger than broadband that we went through 20 years ago? Okay, how about bigger than the automobile? How about bigger than the Industrial Revolution? So what makes this a really challenging discussion is you start sounding a little bit crazy when you make those comparisons. I think those of us deep in this world feel those comparisons tend to be pretty valid. I'm going to kick things off to a question to everybody. We'll start down with Mitchell and then come across. Because you all are here listening to us, I'm curious, Mitchell, what do you hope to learn from the audience as we go through this? And also, what's one thing that you hope they take away?
So I'm living in Silicon Valley. So the thing that I've been learning, more is the real sophistication on the geopolitical side. At Mozilla, we're more involved in policy from the US side, but still not at the level of sophistication, which increasingly impacts technology and development. And then to take away, I think it is that I didn't agree with bigger, but if you asked of as big, like what is the nature of the change and the transformation we're looking at, how to think about that in a more clear-eyed way.
Great, Matthias.
Mitchell, you just took all my answers. Yes.
Well done.
No, very much the same. Very heads down in tech. Really want to connect to the social aspect and particularly the international social aspect. And yeah, it's big. It's big. We don't seem crazy.
Yeah, I think once you're building or investing in tech, it's pretty important to have a pulse on the difference between the people who are at the head of the curve, who understand it, and the people who are really behind and far away from it. And then with AI accelerating so fast, I think it's hard to keep track of that. So hopefully walking away from this, we all feel like a little bit more close to understanding what's happening.
Great. Because the panel topic is transformation, and because all of us have been fortunate to at least survive multiple transformations, I am curious, and maybe we'll start with you. What lessons from prior transformations that you've operated through do you think apply to this one versus what does truly makes the AI transformation unique?
I mean, there's a lot that I think do apply. I'll just pick one. I think the general hype cycle where when a new idea is introduced, people get excited about it, talk about it a lot, but then when it's not ready, there's that little kind of slump that comes afterwards and the builders have to go heads down and build, and we're seeing that at an accelerated pace, I think. So I think that stays the same. What does seem different is that LLMs, I think, are almost like can translate human language to computer language. And I think that's where the real significance is that historically we've had to have developers as translators between humans and computers. And there was that layer, but with LLMs, you can almost remove that developer, which means humans and computers can collaborate much faster. And I think that's really where some of the interesting impact comes from.
Yeah, I think the thing that's most striking to me about the whole Gen AI space is that it goes into places where we traditionally thought technology couldn't go, right? Like technology is really good at mechanizing labor, and it's been really good at mechanizing computation. But now we are able to effectively mechanize intuition and emotional qualities. And if you think about, the economies of scale that have happened when we've applied technology to these other domains, now that's going to happen in domains that were completely untouchable and unimaginable, right? And that's what I think is really striking to me.
Let's see, to try to answer your question, I think a lot about this transformation is similar in human reaction, surprise, fear, denial, excitement, like extremes. But I think what's different is the speed at which all of that moves throughout the world. Now we have the global network, so it can move that quickly. The range, I think these questions, many of these traits were things we thought made us uniquely human, which now can be automated. We can compute human language. So I think the responses from humanity are deeper over time to that. And the third thing that's really quite different is not only is it quick, maybe it's like the Cold War, but I didn't live through the beginning of that. It's very quick. And there is the concern, either boogeyman or legit, of China, and something happening in a society that's now increasingly closed. And so, like, what's actually happening with AI? What are the actual fears or concerns? What do the AI developers themselves think? There's another, like, parallel universe that's closing. And so, as we have this massive transformation with these consequences, it's got this added element to it that, like, the mobile space or even the internet didn't have when it came.
When we think about the global nature of this, when we think about the uniquely human behavioral limitations we see in Gen AI today, Matthias, I'm curious, you've faced down some massive design challenges over the course of your career, wrangling Google not once but twice to unify their design systems. And I'm curious, as you think about what AI makes possible, as you think about these uniquely um, human-like capabilities, what does that change from a design perspective? What does that change from a product and experiential perspective? Like, what are you thinking about possibly building? What can we do here? And
Yeah,
we
yeah.
are on the record, sadly. So
Well, I think this is the most exciting time for product and digital design than ever because, so much of what we do, we've forgotten how limited it is and how fundamentally lowest common denominator it is, right? It takes so much effort to build these apps and these technologies that we build. They're massive enterprises. The stacks of technology are like what it takes to put a rocket on the moon. And yet, at the end of the day, for all that we strive to localize, to hit specific markets, to make things accessible, we're still constantly lowest common denominator. And it's so impoverished compared to every other realm of design. In the last panel, they were talking about design, thinking about how everything in this room is designed. All of us are wearing, jackets and clothing that is really tailored for us, that's to our tastes, that fits us. We live in homes that are completely unique for our circumstances. But in our digital worlds, we live in these cookie cutter hallways where everybody experiences the same thing. And Gen AI can change that. Gen AI can finally make it so that these digital experiences that we have can be truly personal. And that is so human, right? That's the human potential inside this technology, and that's what I'm excited about is how to bring that capability to life.
do you think that we are there? Like, is this a forward-looking, in another 2 years this will start happening? Do you think it's happening now? Like, where on that journey are we?
Oh, we're starting to see it now, and it's going to accelerate. I think that's a bit of what we were talking about earlier, though, is that the rate of change is hard to predict, and it will have these stops and starts where you're going to be excited because you hear somebody like me say something like this, and then you're going to be like, oh, whoa, I saw some Gen AI user interface thing, and it was really disappointing, and so forget about it. But that's the nature of it. I think it's accelerating and hard to predict, but it's coming, and it's really exciting.
Well, and something that's easy to forget because we've had multiple panels today where everyone is talking excitedly about AI and the amazing nature of it. It can be easy to forget how early on the AI transformation we are. If we had slides and we had put up the traditional S-curve slide that everybody would have put up in talking about AI, we're still on the mostly horizontal part of the curve. So all of these incredible changes that we've been seeing every 2 weeks, every week when a new model gets released, we're still at the beginning. And so that rate of change is going to accelerate. And when we think about what's coming and the capabilities that are coming, one of the real challenges if you've been trying to build things with AI is Gen AI and AI has these remarkable capabilities. They amaze us, but they still lack a lot of, frankly, really core capabilities that a human in the loop would bring to you. Things like memory of the overall task or how to chain different steps in a task together. And you hear that talked about as like autonomous agents. You hear it talked about as memory. And yeah, I'm curious because you've been spending a ton of time exploring this and exploring it in public because it seems every week or two, another one of your ideas is up on GitHub and you can play with it. Uh, what are you seeing as you think about that space? What do you think is coming? What do you think we're close to?
I think when new technology is introduced, and this is just a pattern that I noticed, is that there's a lot of experimentation. If you look at old cars, there's three-wheeled cars, steamboat, steam engine cars. But if you look at cars today, they all kind of look the same. Same with phones, flip phones, brick phones, big keyboard phones, but all our phones look the same if you look at them from the front. I think with agents and AI, we're in that rapid experimentation phase where people are trying a lot of things. Like the people now are the Wright brothers of this like autonomous agent space where they're publicly experimenting, showing what they're trying, and some of those are going to stick. And so it's going to be a combination of, I think, best practices and opinionated approaches by who ends up becoming the market leader. And there's going to be some consolidation. But yeah, right now is that just the rapid experimentation phase.
But while you're experimenting, do you see actual like production capabilities at this point? After all, we're talking to investors and leaders about change. And one of the changes we're contemplating fundamentally is, will AI take over something that today you had to pay a person to do, or you had to pay people to do, or you had to pay contractors to do? Like, where are we on that journey? Because a lot of the change, this is the crux of it.
Yeah, I think we touched on it briefly. I'll try to keep it short. But in my mind, there's three types of autonomous agents. There's what I call the handcrafted agent, where you're writing each prompt and chaining them together. Some people might not call it autonomous because the LLM is not getting the task list, but to the extent that it will do a chain of tasks for you, it is autonomous. Then there's what I call the specialized agent, which can come up with its own task list and do stuff, but it's within a subset of tasks using subset of tools. Those are starting to work. We're seeing those raise some capital. Maybe some of them have closed pilots, at least from what I can tell. And then there's the third one, which is the generalized autonomous agent, which is the can literally do anything you ask it to do. And I haven't seen anything that's close to reliable there. So that's kind of where I see us now. When it comes to the handcrafted agent, I see companies charging tens of thousands of dollars and with zero churn because those are working. We have a portfolio company called Wokello. I can type in a company name and 30 minutes later, I get a 30, 50-page report that has market leaders, competitors, market research, and those. I think so. That's kind of where we are today, at least from where I'm seeing.
So as we think about that kind of level of excitement, right? Things that were just blatantly sci-fi if we were having this discussion 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 18 months ago. This isn't the first time that we've had waves of technology, particularly waves of software, get involved in our day-to-day lives, start being deeply plugged into both our work and how we think about experience. Mitchell, you have more experience than many of us in the strengths and weaknesses that emerge in these transitions. And particularly, you were a transformative part of bringing more and more of that code into open source, to mobilizing mixtures of both employees and volunteers to drive change. Which of those do you think are critically important to AI? Which of them do you think will kind of come along anyway? How do you think about that?
Well, open source today is often experienced as convenience. But the core principles that drove this weird idea in software development into the mainstream as open were much deeper. And so open source, the movement that brought it out of freakish and dangerous and attacked into, and in the United States, communist, that's a Microsoft phrase, by the way, for open source. The power in it that brought it into mainstream, into open, into collaboration, into sharing were access, collaboration, freedom. The four freedoms were the fundamental basis of it. And so those are based on who has access to the technology of our era and what can you do with it. And in particular, how much control does the original author have over you? And so open source as a philosophical underpinning is a decision that even as the creator, you prefer collaboration and sharing and the greater benefits that accrue to complete control yourself. And I would say those things are fundamental in AI. My view is we don't have a clue where we are on the curve. Yes, the agents that you've described may be here soon, and that'll still be version 0.1 of what the ability to compute cognition means over time. And so if all of that ends up closed in the hands of the people that have the massive wealth to build it today, then big parts, not just of our society, but our own thinking process are now unavailable and we have no control. So I think the fundamental aspects that made open source powerful enough to break through to the mainstream are still really important. In the first era, we fought the battle of it's not secure. You can't have security in open source, which turns out to be backwards with software, but certainly took some time and some work. We had it was a radical thing. And so today it's a very mainstream thing. And I think as a mainstream idea of just convenience, is probably going to get shot down by the current wave of security, and then at the end, China, and so I think the values of who controls, in this case, it will be our cognition and our thinking, it is important. So that question of hearing a lot of fear about it, both in business models, hearing a lot of fear about security or some other things, we've been through those before. And so those bear looking at, fundamentally untrue in software. Like we can say that now. There are some things about is you have to handle data differently. So open source as a model, the drive of it is, I would say, as valid as ever. And some of the technicalities of how we defined it and what it meant are for software only and need to be updated.
Do you think, so one of the characteristics, certainly at the training of LLMs, is power requirements, compute requirements, but effectively power requirements are a good proxy for compute. Do you think that overwhelms some of the openness discussions because there's such vast amounts of resources and money needed to really go do training? Or do you think that even in that case, when we look at other sort of broad distributed efforts that do mobilize compute from either local, people's local machines, et cetera, like, how do you think about that?
So I'll say short term now and potentially long term, some of which may sound like science fiction too, right? So certainly in the short term right now, the resource requirements are only a few can meet them. And that's probably going to be the case for a while, unless there's a rise in, I think France is really active in this, and then some innovation in Japan as well. But in what does a public partnership look like, or the earlier comment about the work at Stanford from the Anthropic representative about building more public forms of compute resource so that someone other than an employee of a few companies can access. So those kinds of innovations, I think, need to occur. I think that society itself is in for massive changes. Like the democracy that we revere today, wouldn't have any meaning to someone before the Industrial Revolution. And I think we're in for that kind of change again. So I think democracy is changing wildly in the next, period. And so, what is it that we value after it? Access to information, access to power, the ability to have some way to act upon power, elect your representatives. What we have now, and it's not working in Congress. This need for innovation in public structures is really huge. And then just in the long term, I'll say that right now, things are being driven by a few organizations with massive resources. And that's the architecture that gets built when you're in that position. And it may not be the only architecture over time.
You have inspired me, by the way, to add one of them to my, which is greater or less than AI. We'll add the Enlightenment to a comparison. But you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to touch on the open source thing. I think, I'm relatively new to open source, so I'm really piggybacking on all the great work of other people, and I'm just doing small projects. But the reaction to Baby AGI when I launched it was absolutely global. And what was fascinating was seeing people take this small, it was 100 lines of code, but it went viral. And it was so simple that everyone took different approaches on it. But because the first one was open source, all the other ones became open source. And now there's a community of hundreds of autonomous agent developers constantly sharing. And I just wanted to point it out that that experience to me, I think, is what G1 is all about, right? It's the whole globe as one. And I think it was really cool to experience that firsthand as part of the open source community. So thanks for getting that going.
So we've talked a bit about how fast moving AI is, how so many transformations are sort of on the cusp of being significantly greater. But one of the goals with G1 is to always look for actions and solutions. And so, Matthias, I will of course put you on the spot in this case. Uh, you have been in the fortunate but often exciting position of building technology on sort of incomplete and emerging ideas and technologies. And AI seems to be one of the greatest examples of that we could come up with. And so I'm curious how either you think about it for yourself or how you would think about it for, the leaders in the audience of how do you explore making bets that your business is going to depend on, your employees are going to depend on, your customers are going to depend on when it's so fast moving and so complicated and so hard to predict?
I think it's a great question, and I think it boils down to being fast in the same way, right? When your environment is changing rapidly and the risk is high, it almost, in my mind, means that you have to also be able to react rapidly and become very agile, and that's actually the benefit of open source. Is it gives you this foundation of lots of people that can move in parallel, lots of resources that you can build on, so you don't have to invent everything yourself. So I think of it as those two things, right? One is like, what do you do to generate agility in your team, I guess, in your business, so that you can have, the quickest to learn experiment of applying and leaning into the technology and getting into the places where maybe it is mature. If it is not really an agent, but it's providing value, like lean into that in the smallest, well-scoped way possible. The other way I think about it is that there is one certain bet about all of this, is that all of this Gen AI transformation requires your assets to be digitized, right? So in so much as you can make bets to digitize your business, digitize your assets. I'm talking to a museum about this actually in 2 weeks from now, and they have this incredible archive of all of these physical airplanes in this case. Super cool. They got to get that stuff digitized, right? Because once it's digitized, then we can have an agent work with it. We can have an LLM talk to you about it. We can do all of these things. But if it's physical, there's going to be this different, it's like a very real digital divide that is going to be accelerated. So those are the two things that come to my mind.
I love that if this was 20 years ago, we'd be talking about Second Life and everybody needs to digitize all of their spaces. So it is good that everything keeps coming around. Talking about taking the content from people, whether it's physical spaces, books, movies, whatever, all of that obviously happens in deeply regulated environments, particularly when you go transnational. I'm curious to really all of the panelists. It's AI feels like a particularly, I wouldn't say vulnerable, but a particularly targetable transformation to regulation, to the application of laws that maybe weren't even anticipating AI when they came along. Are there aspects of that that either worry you or conversely you think are incredibly important as we move through the coming years of this transformation?
I'll shortly say I think it's really important in the sense that it will absolutely impact the trajectory. But it doesn't really worry me because I do feel like there, to some extent, I kind of believe in the invisible hand when it comes to these kind of things, that there's going to be some push and pull and we'll land on a good middle ground, but I'm an optimist.
Yeah, I mean, where I go, I don't know if I worry about it, but it is going to be a big disruption. And so I guess when there's a disruption, I worry a bit. As democracy might change, I think a lot of our concepts around intellectual property are also being, questioned and challenged. And certainly our legal structures and our social structures are not prepared for the world we live in now. And I think you could have an entire session on just this topic. But I think maybe that's a signpost to, at the beginning you were talking about, like, how big is this? How crazy is it? I think it's going to have those kinds of social and political and policy level impacts in ways that we just don't know what it's going to be. And that's part of why we need to be agile.
Well, both, to your question. But I'm reminded of the earlier session which spoke about the shift from, so this is mostly from a US perspective he was speaking about, but the shift from global trade policy and economic integration into security and national security. And so I don't know that AI is particularly vulnerable to it, or if we're in a time where rapid, obvious change is vulnerable to maybe extremist positions. I think AI, it came after social media, which clearly is damaging and clearly society hasn't gotten a grip on. And there was a long period of fighting regulation that's changed in, tech now. So the period in which AI comes after social media, which we know it's damaging individual psyche and our society. We know that. There's plenty of research on that from kids on up. We can't protect our kids, let alone adults. So AI comes not even of age, but into this wild, like, birth in the middle of understanding that we are in the middle of a 10 or 15-year-old technology. We still don't have a clue how to get right. And so you combine that with the geopolitical thing, and I think we are going to get regulation much sooner. Now, Mozilla's always been an advocate for more regulation than most tech companies, so I don't think that that's bad. But doing it well and getting it right, I think given the environment it comes out of, the chance of a kind of like reactive, overly constrained, or the geopolitics get in the way of what the technology actually is and should be, is kind of high.
I have a quick thing on. So I think when it comes to socials, I think with technology, a lot of times the benefit goes to people who are underserved, actually. And this is kind of half baked, but when I think of social media, I push back on just the negativity because I think of a lot of positive cases where protests were able to be successful and got global attention. But all those cases tend to be more in third world countries. And perhaps I'm suggesting that AI might be similar in the sense that if you're in the if you're in the US and you have a good job, then like maybe, yeah, sure, you might have to worry about your job reskilling. But if you think about the amount of information that people in the third world country have access to, and maybe they don't have internet, but they can load up a small model that can give you all the survival skills. I don't know exactly how it's going to look like, but I think there is an opportunity for AI to really help people who are further away. I don't know. That was just my gut thought.
Well, and one of the clear decisions that we will see struggled with by policymakers is going to be, think of all the areas where especially a fine-tuned model today could be superior to access to nothing. So think about guidance counselor, legal advice, first wave medical advice. It's obviously not as good as a human, but a friend of mine talks about a best available human, and if the AI can exceed the quality of the best available human, then use the AI. But of course, in many regulated industries, this runs into a great deal of complexity, and frankly, risk from those creating, risk from those deploying, and how we navigate that, I think, is going to be one of the more interesting aspects that we follow in the coming years. But I think part of that goes back to you're all obviously familiar with this, but how LLMs are trained is they hoover up a voracious amount of, just an unbelievable amount of content. And part of how they then get tuned is to be credible. It tends to be one of the most unique signal characteristics of large language models, is that they tend to produce credible output. And I highly recommend, if you have not seen it as leaders, Boston Consulting Group did a lovely experiment where they inserted GPT-4 into their normal workflows. And it turned out if it was a task that was sort of within the capability of the LLM, everything got better. It was higher quality output, it was done faster, it was done cheaper. If it was outside the boundary of what the LLM could understand, it was interesting. Still faster, still cheaper, more believed, and less accurate, which is not a great combination when you pause and think about it. So I'm curious whether that aspect of AI, this ability to do very believable, very credible, does that make it different? Does that make it for different challenges for leaders to be thinking about this? How should they be? Obviously, everybody hears about hallucinations. Like, what should they think about this?
I'll jump in on that. I think there's the short term kind of answers, which are deploying any of this type of technology, you have to be thinking about evals, you have to be thinking about red teaming, you have to be thinking about, all the safety and the structure that goes around things. And you have to get past the idea that the LLM is the product, that the LLM is just a piece of a technology product that you can apply, to a problem or in your business. I do think, though, ultimately it goes to what's interesting about the nature of the transformation, which is these systems are not always going to be accurate in ways that are human-like, not accurate, but maybe better than the best available human. And so one of the things that I'm actually curious about myself when I think about this is does there come a point where we stop thinking about integrating these systems the way that we integrate technology, where we manage technology, which is like we just have a black box test and then we run, forever. Maybe we have some guardrails, and instead integrate it more like we do in a human organization, right? Where there are check-ins and there are reports, and there's an assumption of oh gosh, your customer representative did something wrong, and so we're going to give you some credits back or something, right? Like, because that's with this accelerated power, you're going to have some of this error rate. And I wonder if we might not actually learn from what's worked with human organizations. I don't know. Maybe that's taking it too science fiction.
Except we were literally talking about this over coffee this morning, that where in the org chart does the AI sit? And
Naturally, people think it's going to be on the bottom rung, but yeah, it could manage some people, right? Like a college ambassador program. I mean, if you think about it, Amazon Mechanical Turks, it's not even AI and it's managing people. Give it LLM and what can it do? And if it can manage people, why couldn't it also be the CEO? Available 24/7, no personal bias, or at least consistent bias, fully transparent.
The no personal bias. That sounds like science fiction to me today.
So, it's consistent bias, right? The one bias is
I don't care if it's consistent against me, right? Consistency does not help me. If every single place I go, my gender gives out bias, like that is not like, okay, got it.
No, absolutely. That's a good point.
well, and actually sorry, just to follow this for a moment, because I think this actually gets back to some of the open questions when we think it's because LLMs are at first completely dependent on their training data, and then they are completely dependent upon the tuning that is applied to them. And those two things can often result in spectacularly bad behavior in a number of different axes. And this seems like an area that open has already taught us how to approach in many ways. Not that it doesn't fix bias, but it does at least expose what training went into or what decisions were made that generated it.
Or to the rapid, sorry, you happened to get one of my buttons. I didn't intend to like go to intense mode, but sorry. A couple things, the rapid experimentation and prototyping, rapid idea testing, what could you do, all of the things that you might do to detect, but also develop tools or change in bias. Like systems that are good at understanding and access and experimentation and giving the opportunity to the people who care about it most, rather than waiting till the original creators get to a point where they care about it, which sometimes never happens. So I think Open's got a lot to offer there. And then also, like, you really piqued my interest in thinking, we're so early that probably part of the social, hopefully low level of literacy is that these first answers are not always right. That there's a process of which you get an answer, it sounds credible, but it could be totally false. There's some process. It won't be just one AI on its own. You'll have yours, I'll have mine. Like, is there a conversation? Is there a check back and forth? So that hopefully our architecture progresses beyond where we are now, where you get these totally credible answers that are made up and you have no way to figure it out.
And society will evolve with the technology as well, right? As earlier forms of technology were also more influential until society adapted and understood its limitations, right? We tend to always worry about the children and the younger generations, and then it turns out they're oftentimes very resilient to things, maybe that even we're more vulnerable to. I was going to actually just go back to pushing back on the idea of where I was going was not at all of the idea of like have an AI be the boss, but more just have the structures where the AIs are treated like people. And I actually do think it's important to have a human, ultimately be the boss. That's what the point of it is, right? And I don't know.
Definitely spoken like a human.
Oh, okay. I see. You're the trader.
It'd be interesting to see if an AI as a manager, how much, if they were practically more efficient at some set of tasks, and then you might actually want your first point of contact to be whatever's the most efficient.
I have seen some CEOs starting to test having an internal AI version of themselves that employees can ask questions against. And so far, there's clunkiness and it's still early experiments, but it seems like it's working well in some cases where the employees feel like they're getting closer to the CEO, even they're talking to an AI version of them. It's interesting.
But there's an important distinction there of agency, right? Like one is what you're describing here is more like an extension of the CEO, an augmentation of the CEO, which ultimately the entire organization is an augmentation of the CEO's will and intent, right? Another one is like just replace the CEO, right? Like the CEO's never left their office, and you've only talked to the AI. Is he even there anymore? Is she even there anymore? I don't know.
Yeah, the extension of these experiments is when the CEO is gone, the AI just keeps doing its job, right?
Yeah.
Actually, the original idea for Baby AGI was actually to prototype an autonomous startup founder. And I just thought, why not try it? And that turned into Baby AGI. I do think that will happen, right? Like maybe not like an innovative startup, but like, I mean, I think more than 50% of trades are algorithmic today, right? So why can't we have, a drop shipping e-commerce website that's 100% run by AI? Seems like it's boilerplate enough that we could do that.
I will note to the audience for a minute that just pause for a minute. The conversation that we were having here in a actually fairly serious way. Imagine if a panel was having this discussion 2 or 3 years ago, right? It would just be completely unbelievable that this would be possible. And even though much of what we're talking about is somewhere between not working and barely working today, part of being in this space is that you see how possible it is becoming. One thing where your accuracy comment that also piqued my interest, there are many, many tasks where quality is not measured by accuracy, which is certainly a place where I suspect many of you and many of us have played with AIs when it comes to idea generation and just helping you get outside of an idea or outside of a box. I'm curious, do all three of you use AI day to day? And if so, I mean, I know you're using it, you're building it, but that's actually a little bit different than using it. You're using it every day?
I use it every day for everything from complaining about my house taxes going up and having it generate comps and do math and submitting it to the county to helping me draft LP apologies that I really don't want to write because that process is painful. Like I use it for absolutely everything. Of course, I edit and review everything, but yes, I think like 80% of the things I output, maybe like 50% is like AI.
Edit and review. See, it's still happening. No, yeah, I use it maybe not every day. I mean, it's weird because I do work with, again, building AI, but I try to use it. I'll at least come up with a new attempt at least once a week to try something I haven't tried before.
Not on the scale of everything, but there's a work one, like a summarize one, that is pretty useful. And then I also try on a kind of a visual, not related to work, test out how to explain visual things and what you get back in response. Trying to get out of words and text a little bit.
Because I think something that is very important to a transformation is to be building some amount of intuition about what's happening. And if we were talking about even classical AI or the reemergence of AI about a decade ago, we'd be saying, well, if you really want to go understand what's going on, step one is become really good at, matrix optimization and maybe go learn some linear calculus. That's not what you need to be doing for this transformation. What you do need to be doing is spend time pretty regularly understanding what's plausible and possible with the many AIs that are available to you. Because one, it'll start helping you build your own intuition about the transformation. Two, there's nothing like regularly using, whether it's a GPT lake or an image generator, The month-to-month improvement also gives you a sense of where the S-curve is. And the dramatic improvement that you can feel when you're using these products is something you really have to experience. And third, you're going to have, whether they are people pitching, whether they're members of your teams, you have folks coming to you with ideas that are going to seem somewhere between implausible and just crazy pants. And you need some amount of understanding of AI to be able to be a good leader in those moments, because that really surprising idea may be the one that you really need to be listening to. And I'm sure all of you have had those moments as you've been using AI.
I have a good example I can share real quick. I'll keep it short, but recently I've started doing this thing. Thanks to Twitter, I have a decent following. I'll ask a question I'm curious about, and then people will respond to it. And I just copy paste the entire response into AI and say, "Can you summarize this and bucket it for me?" And it just gives me a summary of everybody's response. I don't even read everybody's response. I just copy paste the whole thing. But I think as a leader, if you think about asking every employee for their opinion and synthesizing it, that seems really painful. But AI is really good at that kind of things. And I think through transformation, what Mitchell said earlier, it is all about humans in the end. And I think communication, right? That's one of the things that AI can help with, personalizing, making sure people felt heard. There's immense opportunity for AI to help leaders with that. But I think to his point, like you need to build that intuition through experimentation and figure out what would work for you and your organization.
Excellent. I think rather than trying to squeeze in one of our own additional questions at this point, why don't we open up to the audience? And what would you get? There we go. You were first. It's first within my field of view. So you come up next.
I mean, I hope it's well regulated. That's my thought.
Well, I'm going to wander on a tangent for just a moment, back to self-driving cars and the question about self-driving cars and what decision does it make? In an accident setting, does it pick A or does it pick B? And how worked up as human societies we get about that, even if those self-driving cars reduce the overall accident rate by 50 or 60 or 75%. That's not what we look at as humans. We look at in that one moment, what decision did it make? And so it's quite possible that the responses of an automated system are better than human responses. Or I guess if you get to high enough altitude, by definition, they're going to be better. So I don't know what the regulations are for the use of F-16s. But that's what I would look at. And then you have a whole different category of, is it ethically legitimate to be killing human beings using F-16s if you're not risking any of your own, right? I mean, you have that whole set of things about how do we use automated military devices, when and if and how. So I'm not sure if you're asking that, but to me, that's a little outside the scope. But on the other one, it might actually be better and more efficient and less mistakes.
Well, and again, as leaders, something to think about in those cases is I think we've seen more and more employees having strong opinions about this. And, if you are operating in a space where you are dependent upon your teams and your employees, which basically is all of us, understanding who you are as a business, what decisions you are willing to make, what decisions you want to make, particularly in military applications, policing applications. These are very fraught questions that as organizations, it becomes very important that you're clear. Because you can make whatever decision you want to make as a company, but you're going to have to be clear because it's going to impact how you can hire and retain and operate, and how effective you're going to be.
First, just want to say this is the highest bandwidth panel of the day, so thank you all for that. I've gotten a lot of value from it. I'm Simeon. I'm an AI infrastructure entrepreneur, and my question for the four of you is, I think that there's been clear winners so far in, let's say, the AI model space and in, let's say, the AI chip space with NVIDIA. Where is not clear to me, and in fact, I don't think the winning idea is out there yet, is the interface that humans and AI will interact with. I'm convinced it's not chat. It's not virtual assistants like Google Assistant or Siri. It's also not the humane pin, it's something else. And while I don't expect you to generate that idea live on stage, I'd love to know what you think are key elements of what that idea will entail.
It so happens I have strong opinions on this topic, so maybe I'll go first. To go back to the point that I was making earlier, I kind of reject the notion that there is one correct interface here, right? The power of the Gen AI moment is in going to be able to adapt multiple interfaces. And I completely agree with you. I also completely reject this idea that when we talk about AI, you should be thinking of it as a conversation or as a chatbot only. There are times and places and tasks and needs for which conversation is fantastic. There's other times you just want to be on a whiteboard. And there's other times when you're just driving in your car and you want that, that speed and that distance and like, oh my gosh, this other car is swerving into your lane, to be right there in your field of vision, right? So the question is not what is the interface to AI. The question in my mind is how can we give everybody the right interface for the time and place that they're at for them, right? And AI is going to be a tool that is finally going to be able to make that happen. But thinking of AI is like almost like, oh, it's the cell phone, and what's the right interface for the cell phone? I think that kind of confuses it because AI is not a thing in of itself. It's this ingredient that is going to enable us to reach this next whole category of things where everything is smart and responsive and really tailored to you, to each of you.
Actually, like, I agree. I would say that like it's probably going to be somewhere similar to humans in the sense that like I want to be able to chat with it, but I also want to just assign it a task in my task list. And if I want to text it because I'm out and about, I want to be able to text it, right? Like the same way I want to engage with people with more than one interface. Like I want my agent to be accessible from all sorts of interfaces, I think.
I think the multimodal piece may go further than we think. So I imagine, I agree. I think there's no one interface. I can imagine a conversation is where we spend most of our time, some set of conversational interfaces, but there's also visual interfaces and what physical space do I want to be in? Do I want to actually experience? So I think that these other modals are, if you want to immerse yourself in sound, those are wildly different interfaces than text and chat and doing tasks, which are productivity. But I think the human experience, like of what's the interface for multiple senses, are really still in the science fiction world. So I'm interested as you develop them.
I think the other part that's easy to get lost when we talk about the current crop of AI is it's often easy to start focusing just on the largest versions of these models that tend to be very good at conversations, and we quickly get into these very human-like interaction models. I think for those, I'm always drawn back to Isaac Asimov's the sci-fi author. He once was asked why his robots looked like humans. Because, what was the reason for this? It's like, well, it meant it was logical. They could take over human tasks because the world is built for humans. And so I think a lot of the examples you just heard are these very human-like interactions. Flip side is that same tech also becomes a replacement for what is today an actuator or a sensor or some other at the edge device, which of course, to me, immediately goes back to sci-fi again, because if you've ever thought about trying to build the doors in Star Trek that magically perfectly open as people approach them with the intention of going through them, but never in any other situation, has been a hilarious comp sci joke task for years, and one that many of us have tried to write for games. And with LLMs, you actually could do that, and you could do it just in a little chip sitting there. So I think we're going to see much smarter interfaces everywhere, with, of course, all of the concomitant security and privacy issues that immediately raises.
I had a reaction to some of your comments, and I wanted to ask for your reaction to my reaction. You talked about the idea that you could replace a CEO potentially with a bot of some sort. which I was offended by.
Say, sir, you're a CEO.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Recently,
Just wanted to know
as
where
of
the
recently,
biases
as
were
of
in this
recently,
question.
a couple times, yeah, public software companies like DocuSign and Responses. But then I started thinking about it. I said, a lot of things actually too. Maybe that isn't the highest order, and where you spend your time as a CEO. Gosh, maybe that could be replaced. But I thought about this idea of the communications, both the survey and reading surveys, which I tried to always do religiously. As an employee, if the topic is leadership, I'd be pretty disappointed to find out that at the humanness level, you were saying, I'm just going to replace me with this, AI image of me, and you should be led by that. I don't think I'd be very motivated. I'm just curious what your thoughts about that.
I think it has to do with framing, right? I think if I was a CEO of a 25-person company and I did that, it would come off as pretty rude. But if I'm the CEO of a 100,000 person company, I feel like people would feel like, okay, there's an effort there to build connections. So I do think it does all, like, it's not the what, but it's more the how. It's my thought on it.
My reaction, sorry, I didn't know if you were going to jump in, was just that build connection with what? If in this hypothetical you've replaced him, sorry, I missed your name, with a with a bot. I mean, this actually goes back almost to the interface question where we keep thinking of AI also as personified, even of an agent as personified. But I actually wonder if more of the potential is, what if the agent is augmentative, right? In the way that your eyeglasses are enhancing your eyes, is an agent, perhaps a CEO agent, augmenting your mind and your will as a CEO, but there's still a human there, and a human intention, and a human that can build a connection or create a vision. That makes me feel okay. I don't know.
I'd add, I think it might depend on the kind of company. And where, if what you're trying to do is known and it's an efficiency piece or it's a team building piece, maybe you might build teams with less, where the whole company is less the extension of the CEO. And it has especially your shipping option. If you still got people in the mix, like, what you're supposed to do, what good looks like, why are you doing it? Maybe because efficiency is good, maybe because that's how you get paid, maybe because your team members rely on you, and then your team relationship is more important than someone else. But certainly for the companies here, probably that you've led and that I've led, that would not work, right? And that there are those companies where you're trying to do something that's ambiguous, that's unknown, that's hard, that requires employees to do more than you might have expected I could do. When you look up and you or your team had done something you didn't imagine, or you imagined but was too hard, but you tried it anyway. Like, there is a leadership quality in that. And I would prefer to say that the team can lead itself. That would be, my ideal, but my experience is no, like, leadership really matters. And so in those settings, I do agree. You may have an augmented, maybe if someone can get to the Mitchell bot and hear what I would have said, that's helpful. But if it's not backed up by the actual authenticity and the commitment and the belief to what at least my org is trying to do, it would fall flat.
But I think if you start from the augmentation or the superpower perspective, it becomes very exciting. Many of us have been fortunate to scale companies and go through those different transitions where your style as a leader suddenly becomes completely wrong. And not because the team has changed, not because you've changed, but because the scale dynamics of the techniques you chose just don't work anymore. It's a little bit like, for a lot of leaders, the transition to remote work was actually because they weren't able to be as impactful or as charismatic over video as they are in person. And how did they navigate that? So when you think about things that work today with LLMs, pretty spectacular. Summarization, like, take all of the tweets and pull all the key themes out of that. How many situations as a leader do you have where that would just be a superpower? Think about, for missed events, how often they're recorded and transcribed, but actually most of the people who missed it don't need the full hour. What they need is, what were the key points? What was a decision changed? What about especially really distributed organizations where changing decisions don't have clear ways to percolate up, because as humans, we use hierarchy to collapse that information. What if you could just scan all of it and be like, what changes have happened? And so I think that aspect as a leader is and everywhere in an org becomes very, very exciting. And that all works today. It has privacy concerns. It has compute costs. It has certainly abilities to do it incorrectly or poorly, which then the credibility is going to bite you. But I think your reaction is exactly right, and the opportunity is super enticing.
Looking for some advice. So I'm head of technology for Japan's largest life insurer. And with your initial question, I put my hand up to both because we're investors and we're also users. And where I'm looking for advice is the whole open source versus the other thing. So I spent the early part of this week in Seattle with one of our partners who explained and we discussed how they're going to help us with our office environment and make it really efficient. Yet I'm looking for differentiating in how I deploy our AI tools. And what terms do I speak to my board in? A board that is already wondering about even using that company from Seattle for fairly simple things like email. And I'm trying to explain to them about underwriting human health and putting human health decisions into an open source AI. And I see the big 3 or 4 in Washington very often attempting whatever on a regulatory capture, whatever, and that concerns me. But I lack the vocabulary to explain this.
I think, and certainly panelists will weigh in. One piece of that, and actually a question, how many of the audience are content creators? So we actually have an interesting bias in this audience, because if we had content creators, there's a whole different wave of questions that I would be expecting, which is similar to yours, about what happens to data that moves into these models. And we will not do it in 2 minutes and 23 seconds, but there is a large difference between data that becomes part of the model, either because you're training a model, you're fine-tuning a model, or you're pre-training a model. And any situation where those things are happening and you are a content creator or content owner, you should be very, very thoughtful about it. Because in those cases, things that traditionally would have been yours are now permanently part of the model and can be exfiltrated. And so, and that is independent of whether the model itself is a commercial model or an open source model. So finding the right resources to deeply understand that distinction is a very important starting point and a very practical one. What is nice is both commercial models and self-hosted open source models give you a great deal of control over that decision. And expanding context windows also reduce some of the risks here, because less information needs to move into the model. But that is a starting point that's very important in this discussion.
I would just write down bullet points of all the concerns and then some notes from your meetings and then just ask ChatGPT. No, I'm serious. It'll probably give you a decent answer that you can start from. Just use AI to ask the AI the question. You can use an open source model if you want.
Shop around. Also ask Gemini, you know.
Claude says.
I mean, I think Corey's point is a really important one in terms of becoming proficient in some of the basic, you know, conceptual language to train the board on is that difference between training and inference, right? And understanding the different types of exposures of products and interactions between those two is really key.
Because in the inference case, you're telling the board we're going to use math, which as an insurance company you've been doing for a long time. So we are a group of rule followers. And so since we are approaching the end, I'm going to just take a last moment to thank the panelists for joining me on stage. Thank you all for such great questions. And thanks to G1 for letting us be here.